So how many people here don't have a drip system? Okay, do not.
We being honest?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to cover a lot about how to judge how much water, when and how and where. But I'm not going to cover the plumbing to get to the tubing. I'm not going to cover the main assembly because that would take a lot of time. So let's get going. We got a lot to do. Lake Shasta in '91 is probably a whole lot worse now. Mulch, well, preaching to the converted, but the 4 inches. My idea is if you get a mulch that settles, not big, thick wood chips, but a mulch that settles down, this is what we call arbor mulch in Sonoma County. If you buy 4 inches of it, that's about the maximum amount that you can afford to buy and get a good return on your investment. When you get above 4 inches, the extra cost of the mulch doesn't get you significantly greater reduction in water. Does that make sense? Okay. Duh. Now, I'm going to talk about drip irrigation. The important part is number 1, superior growth. Because a lot of people don't realize that drip irrigation produces better results than any other type of irrigation that's used. I work a lot with vegetables and edible landscapes, but basically there's a woman in India, she used 38% less water to grow her chilies, but she got a yield of 48% more chilies. That yield equivalent to better growth on ornamentals, better leaf on ornamentals, better flower on ornamentals, better fruit on ornamentals. So that water conservation everybody knows about, but a lot of people don't realize how important drip is for the best quality of growth, and in the case with vegetables, superior growth. Now, this is not a very good way to water, but guess what? You get some advantage in the summer, you get rainbows. Now, we get into the science of it. Evapotranspiration is the water loss from evaporation from the soil combined with water loss from transpiration from the foliage, ET, evapotranspiration. It's measured in number of inches per month, and which is across here. You get the number 6 inches, 4 inches, 5 inches from your cooperative extension. If they can't tell you, you fire them. They should know. I'm going to show you later what they are for Los Altos. But basically, in a warm summer day, 6 inches is the equivalent ET rate for July in this area. So you go down the column, that means for 100 square feet of foliage, 12.5 gallons a day is lost. That's per day, not per week. So if you water once a week, you've got to water 12.5 times 7 to get the total number of gallons to replace just what was lost, not to supplement. Oops. So the ET rate is based on a cool season grass 4 inches high. And that's sort of like the 1.0, that's the ground zero of ET rates. Anything that's less than 1.0 is water conservation. Anything above 1.0 is overusing water. I don't use emitters, punched in emitters. I'll explain why in a second. But if you happen to be obsessed with them and like to deal with them breaking off all the time, stepping on them and crushing them, replacing the holes with super plugs, and finding another place to put another emitter, you could use these. But if you're going to use emitters, make sure you get pressure-compensating emitters. These are the only ones that put out the same amount of water at the beginning of the system and the end of the system. All these others, if you put the others at the beginning of the system, they'll put out a lot of water compared to at the end of the system. I never use spaghetti except in certain container plants. The stuff breathes. And you come out the next day, there's more of it, and it's broken, and it's flopped over to where you didn't want it to be. It's a mess. Whoops, there's a fast button. So I don't use emitters. And I'll mention pretty soon, I don't put the emitter, if I use one like that, at the very base of the plant. So don't do either one of the things in the photograph. What I use is inline emitter tubing. And the emitter is built inside the hose, the half-inch drip hose. It has a very large opening because of the nature of the self-cleaning emitter on the inside means we can have a very big hole that doesn't clog easily coming out of the emitter. So the hole that comes out of the emitter is much larger than any of the other punched-in emitters I just showed you. And then the plants like to duplicate what's going on with it. So this is non-compensating inline emitters. That means that, again, if it's rated at a half a gallon hour emitter, it might do that at the beginning, but due to friction loss, it's much less than a half gallon emitter further down the line. But the pathway is what cleans the water, keeps it from, not cleans it, but keeps it in suspension. I don't know if, can you see those little right-hand turns? Every time the water makes a right-hand turn in the emitter, it goes into a sideways tornado. And that keeps the silt and sediment in suspension till it gets to that big hole. So they're self-cleaning. This is the inside of a pressure-compensating emitter. Here's what they used to call the tortuous path. Again, every time it hits a corner, it turns into a sideways tornado. So it's self-cleaning. But there's two flaps here, and one is more rigid than the other. And when the water is, let me put this down for a second. Well, maybe I can't.
Here, you can handle it.
Okay. When the water comes through at a high speed, the flaps squeeze towards each other. When the water is low volume, they spread apart. So at the end of the system, they're spreading apart more and letting water come through. And at the very beginning of the system, they're squeezed together more and they limit the water so that you get a half a gallon an hour at the beginning and you get a half a gallon an hour at the end. So that you might have 250 feet of tubing, you can still get a half a gallon an hour anywhere along the length of that tubing. And to show you what that means, this is 12-inch centers is a common way to buy inline emitter tubing. The emitters are every 12 inches, half a gallon per hour, means that you can go without friction 369 feet off one valve or one zone. That's very different than a lot of other systems, and it's not at all. It's much better than punched-in emitters. And for those of you who like to use 1/4-inch inline emitter tubing, if you go 6-inch centers, you really shouldn't go more than 15 feet total off of one valve because of the friction loss. If you're using 12-inch centers at a greater flow rate, you can go 20 feet, 20 to 30 feet, I mean. So that this is in the backline book for you to figure out exactly how far you can go and have good water distribution along the length of the line.
What's the expense of the nice pressure compensating ones?
Okay, can we wait till the end so I can get, because I got a lot to go through. I want to try, but keep the question in mind, I'll answer it.
We're good on time.
So, okay, we're good on time.
We're good on
So inline emitter tubing is what I use, and here we see it in parallel rows in the landscape. And the emitters are every 12 inches in a loamy soil. Every 18 inch, you buy it every 18 inches apart in a heavier soil, because the water spreads out fatter in a heavier soil. The rows then are about 12 to 18 inches apart in this commercial landscape. And what you see is the irrigation system regardless of where the plants go. Because the plants are going to be put where the design says they go, not where the emitter is. In fact, with native plants, you want to avoid the emitter so you don't get too much water in the crown of the plant. So I'm going to explain a lot more of this, don't get too worried yet. But basically, the roots of these plants, if you put a plant in here, in a very short period of time, the roots are going to be here. So that this whole system waters the entire root zone of all the plants in the planting. It does not water one plant with one emitter. And that's the way you get the most growth. The next way you get the most growth is to water every day. Now, people get totally freaked out when I say water every day for drought-resistant native plants. It's the best way to get plants going, and then you can wean them off of it and go towards less water, which I'm gonna go through on the slides, how to tweak it down to less water. And then if you want, you can go to intermediate irrigation once a week or once a month, but it's a way to get things really established and growing quite well before you start to tweak it down too far. And in the case of that one I mentioned in Chile, the chilies in India, they were doing daily irrigation, but it's very tiny amounts of water. And I'll explain that later. What we're shooting for is to have what looks like dry spots in the soil on the surface, and then wet spots here, with 12-inch spacings on a loamy soil, somewhere down 2, 4, 6, 8 inches, it's continuously moist, not wet. I try to never use the word wet, because we're trying to create a soil that's moist that you can pick up and it'll crumble in your hand. The only way you can tell that it's not dry is it's a darker color. You cannot possibly feel any moisture in it, but it's moist, and the plants can utilize it. So regardless of the slope or the planting, we put parallel rows. Because there's that pressure compensating emitters, you can have that tubing at the top of the slope and at the bottom, and you still get the exact same amount of water coming out of this as you have coming out of that, regardless of gravity. And how does it work, this superior growth? When we use a sprinkler and irrigate a large area, the whole surface of the soil gets slightly anaerobic. And the beneficial bacteria that like to be in that top inch or 3 start to die or go to sleep. So that anaerobic soils are not good for soil life. And with drip irrigation, the area that is too anaerobic for soil life is a very small amount of soil below the emitter itself. Capillary action moves the moisture sideways and down, but it doesn't provide a totally anaerobic environment. It has some air in it, so the beneficial bacteria and microbes and critters that love that can do well in the soil compared to irrigating the whole thing with an oscillating sprinkler or rain bird. Now here we get into an important point. The red lines, excuse me, the red lines are the drip line of the trees. These are squares of 1 meter. Here's the apple tree. Here's the roots. All plants, by and large, grow half again to 3 times wider than the foliage. So remember I said that in the photograph with the lines of tubing? Well, if the plants are growing 3 times wider than the foliage, everything in that landscape's getting watered. And notice how it avoids the compaction of the road. This is a waste of water and not good for especially native trees, a lot of native trees, and a lot of Mediterranean. This is at Kaiser. They ought to at least get rid of this ring, because that's going to rot the hell out of it. And because it's a parking area, that they try to get 1 ring in there so that they can compensate for no irrigation whatsoever. So that's not too bad, but they don't have any options out here. But this is dangerous. This is a waste of money. This is up at the Fetzer Gardens. Drip line at the very base of all these elms. When you realize that the roots go half again in clay soil wider than the foliage, and 3 times or more in loamy soil, you realize it's the grape vineyard that's watering the elms. So when I plant a bare root tree or have a young tree from a container, I never put the emitter here. I put it on a young plant at the drip line. There's a wet spot here, and it's all dry here, and the bulb, so to speak, in a clay soil it's like a rutabaga, in a sandy soil it's like a carrot. Everything in between is more like whatever you want to think of. But, oops, sorry. This is critical, especially to native plants. I don't get the emitter anywhere near the crown of the root system, because that's where Phytophthora likes to grow. Now, I hope I'm not saying the obvious, but basically we have a cycle in Mediterranean climate in California where It's dry in the summer and the soil is warm, so the fungus doesn't like to grow. It's wet in the winter when the fungus would like to grow, but it's too cool, the soil's too cool. So if you take and add water to this, you get everything going wrong. So that we want to keep the water away from this at any cost, and drip is the best way to do that, but not at the base of the plant. So many people, when they do one single emitter on a plant, are taking the emitter and putting it right here because it's a young plant. But in reality, if you've planted this as a young container plant and watered in heavy on the day of transplant and turn on the drip system, you're gonna have continuous moisture across the whole zone. If this starts to dry out, then you've got plenty of roots growing in the wet zone. Now what I do nowadays is, this is an old drawing. I do mounds. I plant everything on mound, everything. 6 to 24 inches depending on the plant, because it'll settle down by up to 50%. So we want it to be a little bit above grade. But there's two reasons for the mound. One is it gives you a whole other way of keeping dry, so that you have no water getting up against the trunk or the base of the trunk. Excuse me. And if this is dry in the mound, the roots want to go boom. So I'm causing the roots to grow faster sideways, and most roots are in the top 12 inches of the soil of almost every tree, shrub, and plant. So let's look at the soil a little bit. If we have a soil like this at Sea Ranch, there's not much root activity happening here. This is parent material, it's solid rock. This is clay and gravel, and this is the topsoil. So we want to work with the soil that we have, but the roots are not going to grow down into this gravel lens. They're not going to make it easy to grow into the clay. They're going to only stay here in the loamy surface soil. So I'm making the assumption in the talk today that you're planting the right roots with the right soil. Because if you try to grow some of the natives with this shallow of a soil, you might have a problem. But I'm going to talk more about it, but basically in the top 12 to 18 inches of soil is 60 to 80% of a tree's root system. And almost no trees make tap roots. They send long horizontal laterals in the surface of the soil, near the surface of the soil. So this is a guy in Japan who has been digging up roots his entire life. There's a 600-page book that cost $1,000, and he has dug up countless root systems. Now I put down persimmon because this is Japan. He doesn't have any California native plants that he's dug up, anything remotely like a California native. But here is 100 centimeters, about 40 inches. Almost no roots below that. Even persimmon is one of those rare plants that's not a nut tree that does have a taproot. So most of the roots are up here about 40, which is 20 inches. So you can see that a huge percentage of the root zone is in this. And notice how far it's starting to go. He did not dig out the sideways growth of trees, which is unfortunate. He just dug out the depth of the root system at the crown. So we can't tell from this one how far the roots are going away from the trunk and wider than the foliage. Well, here we can. Doug fir. These next ones were done in Germany, in native plants in Germany, so there's very few that overlap with us. But Douglas fir, how it is that they have Douglas fir, we have Douglas fir, I don't know. I never saw the boat, but anyway, this is Doug fir. It's 395 centimeters tall, 2,000 centimeters wide, the root system. So we're getting that's close to 7 to 8 times, I can't do math, but the tree is 240 centimeters. So one of the guidelines that some people use is the root system is 2 times wider than the plant is tall. But that's not nearly as reliable as 1/2 to 3 times wider. So in my book, I have, the roots book I have trees that are 7 times wider than the canopy. Now, of the taprooted plants, it's basically oaks, pines, and nut trees. If they are grown from seed, you cannot get a taproot off of a tree that's dug bare root or dug and containerized, or if it does have something resembling a taproot, chances are when you take it out of the can and plant it, the taproot's dead or damaged, so that they don't regrow. But this guy studied the plants in the native landscape as they grew. He did trenches. Whoops, what did we do here? Okay, he did trenches down 200 centimeters, so that's what, 80 inches or so, I think. And used trowels in the side of the trench, and then brushes, and then mapped the root system. My theory is that he had a lot of graduate students. But here we see that there is a lot of root mass down at 80 inches. But notice how much is still up in the top 20 or less. So when you're irrigating for native plants, people tend to think this is the only thing that happens, deep tap roots. Whereas this is very important for growth. Here's an acorn, what does it say, rubro?
Yeah.
Tap rooted, just planted. Now you know how you grab out in the forest, you see an oak this tall, and you try to pull it out of the ground or dig it out of the ground. You can down 2-3 feet, and you still haven't gotten a majority of the root system. So it does tend to do this, but already it's making fibrous laterals. And what I read in Vermonti, how do you say it, the magazine, Vermonti Journal, yeah, is that as oaks get older, the growth of these roots right here gets bigger and bigger diameter and tends to squeeze off and kill the taproot. By that point, there's such a huge fibrous lateral root system that the tree has a massive amount of soil volume to gather moisture and nutrients, more so than what it would have gotten from a taproot. So the oaks in California, at least, tend to convert from a deep taproot to get them going, a competitive edge to get going, and going. Now here's a pine, a lot of sinker roots. Again, 40 inches. Look how much is up here, probably less than 10. Like it is, because it was planted from the seed by nature, has a taproot of sorts. So my proposal is that we irrigate this and forget about this. This is what people say about water deep. Well, how deep are you talking about? So is deep water 6 inches, 12 inches, or 7 feet? I'm saying that the top 12, 18 inches is what you need to keep an eye on for the best quality growth. You can always sabotage or cripple a plant by putting one emitter here. I call it water bondage because there's just a little bit of water right there, and the roots are just going to stay where that water is. They're not going to go out here if you're putting water right here. And that you want to have as much soil volume as possible explored by the root system to get the tree to be weaned off of all fertilizer, all water. So I'm talking about drip irrigation as a way to start a landscape with natives, but wean them off of it over time. But you will develop a massive lateral root system with putting the mulch out here, not here. And I finally found this 58 meters redwood tree, over 58 meters, sequoia rather, gigantea, over 58 meters wide, no taproot, maybe no more than 20 feet here. No, 20 feet. If this is 58 meters, this must be 10, 20, 40 feet. But no taproot, massive side roots. So that when you plant a young redwood tree, sequoia, you need to consider about watering here and not just put the water at the base. And what keeps the trees up a lot of these trees are in wind is they get stabilized by the sideways roots. And remember that pine has sent down sinker roots. And that's really anchoring the tree against wind. And that's what happens with a lot of fruit trees is they have laterals that go out this way and they have a lot of sinker roots that go down. The sinker roots are really good for stabilizing a tree, and they are good backup in times of stress. I mean, they're gonna get moisture down there and nutrients, but not nearly as much as in the surface. So when I come to existing landscape, the drip line's the dotted line. I put the inline emitter tubing and avoid the base of the plant. So it's not just straight parallel lines. I orient them so that the wet spots are on the surface at the drip line or maybe slightly in, but the wet spot doesn't continue further than this, so the crown of the plant is protected. If I'm planting it, then I put it on a mound, so I've double protected it. And by planting it on a mound, I'm gonna encourage the roots to come out here where the moisture is. And not that they smell the water, they just send out a lot of feeder roots to keep going, to figure out what's going on. They find a wet spot or a moist spot, and then they start to multiply. But they certainly don't smell it. So here's a slide from 1978. Inline emitter tubing, parallel lines on a slope, wet spot, wet spot, wet spot, wet spot. Dry as a bone here, it looks like, but it's not. This is in a slideshow I did for the city of Santa Rosa. They made me take it out. Because she said, look, there's no plant there. You're wasting water. Well, this is a rosemary, 12 inches away from here. And the wet spot is probably this far down the slope. It only takes, what, maybe a month, maybe 2 months for the roots to get into this whole zone and utilize the moisture from these emitters. This rosemary is planted in the dry spot between the wet spots, so that the crown is in the dry zone. What I would do now is I would plant it here, so it's uphill from the wet spots, because the wet spot's going to spread here. And it didn't die in this planting, but for really drought-resistant natives, I would plant here. Okay, how is it that the topsoil, upper zones of the soil is so important to tree roots? It has to do with the microbe action, the soil biota. This is the, whoops, do it again. I see what I'm doing. The top 3 inches is the most aerobic soil. If we take an algae, beneficial blue-green algae that helps improve the nitrogen of the soil, in the top 3 inches we have 25 units. It's actually 25 times 10 to the 6th power, so it's a lot of stuff. But we have 25 units. We go down 8 inches, we have 1/5 the beneficial insects, or microbes, algae. So here, we got 1/10, right? Is that right? From there to there. Actinomycetes being something that's sort of like an algae and sort of like a bacteria, fixes nitrogen, helps improve the nitrogen content of the soil. And these are beneficial bacteria. So it shows you a number of things. One, the aerobic zone is so important for the soil life, therefore the roots like to be there. The roots are not going to favor, whoops, sorry, I keep doing that.
No, it's one thing.
They're not going to favor this zone down at 53 inches if they can get plenty of stuff here. There was another point. Well, I got an answer, a solution coming up. So here's another example. What tends to be the case in all the studies I've found, actinomycetes tend to be more of them at the 4 to 12 inch zone. But with everything else, the top 4 inches has so much more than the next 4 inches. Aerobic bacteria. All the soil in this pot on the left is gathered from the top 2 inches of the forest. All the soil in this pot is only from the 2 to 4 inch zone, and this is the subsoil. 50% more growth from the soil in the top 2 inches. So you can see how important having the aerobic zone is for growth of any plant. What you need to do with natives is couple that with moisture, not wet, but moisture, and then you get bountiful growth. My book says, Roots Demystified, change your gardening habits so plants can thrive. Everybody here has planted a tree and it's grown, right? But I want it to be planted and do this. Whoops, not that. I want it to do this. So I want to get the maximum growth in the early life of the plant so that we can get a jump on things. Another thing is, where is the moisture absorbed? And this is probably irrigated plant material, but basically it's all done with economic crops because that's what they research to find ways to help the farmers. But if you're growing sugar beets, the top foot is 34% and the top 2 feet is 66% of the water absorbed. Moisture equals nutrients, so that if the moisture comes in the plant, it's bringing nutrients with it, so that the top horizons of the soil have a tremendous amount of moisture coming from that zone compared to down 6, 7, 8 feet. An example here, it's 4 feet down before you get 50% of an almond tree. Now we're going to get serious. We're back to this chart. I'm going to show it several times. Remember that we're down here now in September between 4 and 5 inch month rating. So that means we may only need to add 8 gallons a day to cover the losses of 100 square feet of foliage. It's not uncommon to have a tree that covers 300 square feet. It's using 25 gallons a day. So that's usually a lot more water than people anticipate. And it's not nearly as much water as people are putting on. I mean, it's usually a lot more water than what people are putting on. So ideally, you would replace that with your irrigation to break even. So here's the ET rates for Los Gatos. I got it off the internet. Google ET rate in the town, and you usually come up with something. So here we are in September, 4.7. The heat of the summer is usually in July in Los Gatos of 6 inches per month. To find out how much to water, you take the landscape coefficient, which I'm going to show you coming up, times this reference evapotranspiration, these numbers, and you get how much water in gallons that you need to apply. If you go to any other book, you'll see, okay, here's the ET rate, here's the 6 inches per month, here's how much water you have to provide in inches per square foot or per acre. How do you convert that to drip irrigation? So this is the only chart that I know of that does it in gallons. It's in both my books. That's a plug. So all plants are not the same. They do not need all plants to have that 1.0 reference that I talked about with grasses. A mature apple tree, what is that, 15% less? I don't know. I'm lousy talking out loud in math. I know that's 40% less. 65%. So there's where we're talking about native plants. Artichokes, Fremontodendron, probably even lower than that. So that we take these efficiency rates, coefficients, and multiply them times the rating. So if we have, whoops, let me go back. If we have 12.5 gallons on a hot day in Santa Rosa, we multiply it times 0.35 for the arid plants to get how much water in gallons. Does that make sense now? Okay. Now this is a very important thing. If you don't know about vocals, you gotta Google this. You don't have to Google this. God knows I can't remember it. But you Google wool calls. It's a system that was put together by the state of California for 5 regions of California. We're considered the coastal region. And they had like 5 to 8 people from the coastal region sit down and say, okay, how much water does this plant need? It's not scientific in the sense of sticking a probe in the soil and measuring it. It's based on anecdotal and observational information from some of the pros in the industry. So that these coefficients show you that a high rating can still save you 30% of the water compared to grass. Very low is over 90% saving. So that these aren't natives, but you know, most people know what woolly yarrow is. So it's low. That means it uses 70 to 80% or 90% less water than grasses. So you take that coefficient, 0.3, times that 12.5, and now you've got a reduced amount of gallons to provide the water that the plant would be happy with. So we look at some of these. These are all ornamentals, not natives, but we got one in here. Uses 80% less water. So with Baccharis, it's 0.2 times 12.5 gives you the answer, whatever that is. So here I have pulled out of the wool calls list a number of native plants. And notice that coast live oak is very low, which is 0.1. Leather oak is low. So even amongst Arctostaphylos and oaks, there's a difference between species. But basically I pulled out a lot of the very low ones to show you plants that can get by with 90% or less water. So I'll leave this on a little bit if you want to write down some of the names, but. So when I end up with, this is at my Asian pear planting in Occidental. The tubing is over 3 feet away from the base of the plant, beyond the drip line. This particular was a test orchard, so I didn't need to worry with mulch. I just threw the stuff out there. Because it's inline emitter tubing, I used a weed eater and nothing breaks. You just take a weed eater, go right over the stuff, and it takes care of the situation. This is my garden in Occidental. It hasn't been watered since 1981.
Wow.
Now, these are all Mediterranean plants, so it's heresy for
No,
today.
it's okay. All right.
But I have same results, but you can't see them in this photo, with salvias and ceanothus, and almost everything else I've tried native-wise, the deer eat it. So I have had to rely upon Mediterranean plants because of the deer resistance, not the drought resistant. So we see a lot of different lavenders that haven't bloomed. Whoops, sorry, we did it again. These haven't bloomed yet, so I have about 20 varieties of lavender and Spanish lavender here. The way I did it is, in particular, this zone over here is a mound. It's about 12 inches high, higher than this pathway. I plant on the mound in the fall only. October, ideally. If it hasn't rained, I hand water it till it starts raining. That's the only time of the year you can plant, period. If you want to get naturalized within the flow of the ecosystem. If you try again to start up a garden in June, you're going to have to water it from day one and for quite a while. When I plant in the fall, I plant a mound on a mound. In other words, I have a mound that's 2 feet high. I make a little pyramid, spread the roots out, put soil on that, so I got a little mound on top of a big mound, and I put down newspaper, 3 to 5 sheets, overlay it 4 inches so the weeds don't go like this, and I mulch the daylights out of it. Since I can get cheap mulch, I can use way over 4 inches. So I get it by the 15-yard load. So that's another section of it. And everybody's doing it. I think I saved enough time to go into a lot of questions. I have enough
Oh, that's
time.
great. Yeah, you
Okay.
have tons of time.
So
Great.
I muscled through it real fast, thinking we were running over. I didn't want to hurt John's time. So let's do some questions.
Yes, you just mentioned planting a mound on a mound, but where are you getting your extra soil?
Okay, in this particular garden,
Can you repeat the question?
good points, I'm sorry. She wants to know, where do I get the extra soil to make the mounds? Two ways I did it. In one of the big mounds, I got tree service chippings. In other words, it has to be from the tree service right away when the leaves are still in it, not wood chips. It has to be the mixture of live green stuff, because when they dump it off the truck, what do you get? Steam. It starts composting. So I made a mound 4 feet high with that. Then next to it, I dug a swale. So I took the soil from here and put it on top, 4 to 6 inches, on top of the mound of wood chips. So I doubled, tripled my drainage flow. It was like this, then it was like this, and now the swale's like this, and this is up higher. And I planted in that 4 to 8 inches of topsoil, and I watered the day I planted very heavily to get the transplant water in it. And then I did the same thing, newspaper or cardboard, and a lot of mulch on top of that. So again, only in October rather, November this year maybe. It's gonna be later. Yeah.
So you planted in the uncomposted tree trimmings were.
No, I took the soil from the swale and I planted, yeah, it's underneath. So what happens is it composts all winter and creates bottom heat. So I'm creating a nice warm environment, not hot at all because it's only 2, 3, 4 feet high. And it's not like a cube, it's not, a cubic yard. But what you're getting is a moisture, but also warmth that allows those roots to just travel like crazy through the soil that you put on top of it. And after 4 or 5 years, it's only 6, 12 inches high. It's subsidence like the water taking a while. Yeah.
I wanted to mention an app that helps with the wool calls.
Oh, good, she's got an app
Yeah,
for wool
it's,
calls.
It's waterwalk.us, and you can plug in your location, and it figures out what your evapotranspiration rate is for your region.
Okay.
It also has all of those plants that are in UC Davis, so you
Good.
can generate plant lists that have very low, or whatever, whatever.
So she's found an app that works with wool calls. So you can download wool calls and look up the plants and figure out what's it called again?
It's waterwalk.
Waterwonk.us.
It's
Waterwonk.us.
really cool.
Yeah, I have only a Go phone. I can't do anything with that. So other questions?
Well, I could look this up, I suppose, but I was just wondering the relative cost of the self-cleaning pressure.
Oh,
control,
great.
'cause
She
I
wants to know
really-
the cost of inline
I
emitter
really
tubing.
want them, and I have to put in some new drip line, and I'm just like.
I'm really glad you asked that
bracing
question.
myself.
I went to a supply store I will not give you the name of. And it's designed so when you come in the front door, there's the rows for the punched in emitters. Both sides of the aisle. Lots of options, tons of options. Over here, almost hidden, is the inline emitter tubing. I took the cost for 100 feet of solid drip hose times 12 emitters. So it's like whatever, 75 cents per emitter. And so I figured out the cost of buying solid, cost of buying 12 emitters, and then the cost of buying 100-foot roll this, 40% less. And I call it the most elegant drip irrigation there is. You
But
cook
is
it
that
up, roll it out, and you're done.
But is that the pressure controlled?
Pressure compensating.
Pressure
yeah.
compensating?
Yeah.
See, I haven't seen that anywhere.
Yeah, well, it's called Tech Line, CV there's Tech Line. What's neat about CV is Tech Line, but it has a check valve in every emitter, so that on a slope, you can run the drip tubing this way down a slope, because the only water drains out this far, hits the check valve and stops it, so that you don't get any water at the bottom of the hill if you do this. But any kind of Tech Line pressure compensating, they don't sell, I don't think, any non-compensating tubing anymore.
Oh, okay.
But NetFM is the manufacturer I like. NET, IFAM, NetFM. No, the other way, NATAFIM. I need a pencil.
NETAFIM USA.
USA, yeah, that's the
Dot
website.
com.
You get a tremendous amount of information based on what I talked about today. And you can find then a lot of specs on their material. And I don't know, but I think you could probably find suppliers via that source. Up our way, it's Wyatt, Harney Farm Supply, Horizon,
Ewing.
Urban Farmer. And if you need to get special stuff, Dripworks is the best mail order source. They feature inline emitter tubing, but they have all the connectors too. Yeah.
How many years before you have to replace the?
How many years before you have to replace the tubing? I have a friend that we put in 1,000 feet of tubing in his garlic farm 25 years ago, and it's still not clogging. And he's got iron water. And you can look at the tubing, and there's a rust right below that hole. And we flush it every spring. It takes 15 minutes for each lateral to flush to get all this stuff out. But we haven't found a single clogged emitter. But we put 12 inches of straw on top of it as you plant. So you got straw at the summertime about this deep. So it's rated by the manufacturer at 10 years in sun. But we all have to mulch it because it looks so ugly. So, yeah.
If your ground is not flat, if you have mounds of different heights.
Right.
And you have boulders and stuff, so do you put these lines on top of the mounds or
Yeah.
around the boulders?
Well, you can avoid the boulder, but you can still use inline emitter tubing here if there's a plant over here. You don't fixate on the boulder, you fixate on the root system of the plants next to the boulder. But I use parallel lines no matter what the mounds are. But because I'm using pressure compensating emitters, I get the even amount of water no matter what the mound is like.
Do you have any experience with subsurface?
I personally did not have any experience with subsurface because I have gophers. It's impossible to do where you have gophers.
Right.
So, yeah.
Are there any problems with over time salt builds up? I've heard a lot of problems in drip
Yeah.
systems with salt issues in soil.
This is less likely to, I'm sorry, right. Do you have salt buildup problems with drip? Yes, you can. The example of the rust in the iron water from the well is an example that it can deal with a lot of that stuff. But that was 25 years ago when they only had the non-compensating emitters. And I think they are better self-cleaning than the pressure compensating because of those two little flaps can get stuff gunked up in there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant in terms of the plant.
Oh, in terms of the
In
plant.
soils, yeah, because the water is so coming out so slowly that it's somewhat concentrating in those
Well, it
areas.
tends to, my understanding in the Central Valley, they like it with tomatoes and saline soil because the emitter comes out slow enough, but it pushes the minerals away from the emitter and away from the base of the plant. But I don't know for sure. You'd have to talk to, because I've never had that problem, saline soil. Yeah.
You mentioned making transitions from the beginning when you first plant the plants and you're watering them every day
Mhm.
to then what you might do at semi-maturity and maturity as
Right.
far as days apart of watering and approximate run times.
So she's talking about, I talked about watering every day or so maybe at the beginning to get good growth, and then making the transition to no water. It's gotta be totally intuitive. It's based on your soil and watching what's going on, and you start with reducing the amount of water maybe every day, but then you start separating to more intermediate, yeah, right.
Intermittent water.
Intermittent, that's what I was trying to do,
Yeah.
intermittent. So that you get more intermittent and less water, and more intermittent and less water, and then you can wean it off. But you have to learn your soil and watch for stress. You know, how are we doing on time?
We're doing great. What, like 2 more questions? or-
Okay, 2 more questions. Oh, yeah, here we go.
Can you use this strategy with inline emitters for planting, say, a row crop like corn?
Okay, she wants to know if you can use a strategy for row crop of corn. Yes. In my book on roots, it shows a corn looking down from the sky, the roots of a corn, 6 feet wide in all directions. So you can put the inline emitter tubing a foot away from the base, no problem. People tend to put it right down the base, but corn is very forgiving. It's not going to rot out. I don't think it's going to rot out. But you can put two, one on each side, you'll get better yields.
Yeah.
Somebody else? Yeah.
Would you repeat or clarify how far you're putting it from the base of a plant if you have established?
Okay, so she wants to know how far I would put the emitter tubing away from an established plant. As far away as possible. In other words, if it's 5 years old, the roots are going to be way beyond the drip
Yeah.
line. So I don't fixate on anything on the drip line. Where do people put their compost? Where they put their fertilizer? Where they put their mulch? Where they put their emitters? Within a foot of the base. They should be doing at least at the drip line or beyond. If you're going to use only one type of tubing, one length of tubing, put it at the drip line. And what I do with trees that are isolated far apart where the root systems don't overlap much, I take a tree and I put a circle at the drip line and I cap one in. I don't tee it into making a complete circle, I cap it. And then as the tree grows older, I put another length on it and spiral out with the drip line. So it keeps expanding. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, so the same for smaller.
Smaller plants, I don't spiral because the parallel lines takes care of that. And so when your plants are young, I try to keep the wet spot as far away from the base as possible without getting it on top of another plant. So it's staggered to some degree. So I think that's it for now. Oh,
Quick one on a clarification on how long you water when you first plant. Are you looking for getting that 18 inches wet and then you switch to the ET?
no, the way I do it, she wants to know how you get it started, right? I take an oscillating sprinkler and I irrigate the entire planting area for the next 1 day's worth of planting area. And I come back when the soil is moist but crumbly. Might be 2 days, might be 3 days, whatever. So I've oscillated, I've got the whole area, soil volume moist, down, 2, 5, 6, 8 inches. Then I put down the drip tubing, then I plant according to the planting plan, not according to the drip hose. And I put the plant in, water the daylights out on it, step on it a little bit to get air pockets out. And then I mulch it, and I turn on the drip system that day. So then you use the ET rates as your basis, time the coefficient, is your basis for how many gallons to put on the plant. So like that job where the rosemary was, I didn't know how to do ET rates then, but I turned it on for 2 minutes. So I'm glad you brought that up, because when you're using intermittent, daily irrigation, we're not talking about volumes of water, we're talking about just enough to replace what was used by the roots from that soil. So since you pre-moistened everything, you only need to replace what the transpiration is. So that means 2 minutes into a half a gallon an hour emitter, we're talking about tablespoons.
But when you water the daylights out of, you're talking about getting it
Right.
really nice and deep, 3 to 4, and really wide.
Well, yeah, as wide as I can for 1 day's worth of planting. And then I usually only go 6 inches, 12 inches at the most, but not too bad because it's a young plant. But you cannot use the drip irrigation system to get the soil moistened if it's dry.
Right, you're always behind it.
Yeah.
All right, I think,
Okay.
thank you, Robert. I think it was really excellent.